Well, greetings everyone and welcome to the Argonaut monthly video covering September 2024 and the first few days of October. Now, there are four things I want to talk about. First, why the 50 basis point cut from the Fed seen in September may not end up to be that bullish after all. Second, why the Chinese so-called Bazooka could in fact turn out to be more like a Peashooter. Third, why the Draghi report on EU productivity is groupthink nonsense. And fourth, how we see the Israeli-Iran conflict escalating and its impact on global energy markets. On September the 18th, the Federal Reserve declared victory on inflation with an aggressive 50 basis point rate cut at a time where, although unemployment is rising from a low level, GDP now is running at a very robust plus 2.5 to 3%. Now, it's important to remember that unlike in the UK, where mortgages are priced off the Bank of England base rate, longer-term interest rates are more important. Now, the yield curve has steepened subsequently, which threatens to disappoint expectations that the new easing cycle should reflate not only the US housing and commercial property markets, but also make refinancing debt easier for marginal assets. So this may mean that expectations of a long bullish cutting cycle that the market is pricing in, so the market expects Fed funds to get down to 3% sometime in 2026, are either misplaced or indeed irrelevant. Now, there are plenty of Chinese bulls that have just emerged from a China shop, because between September the 24th and September the 27th, the People's Bank of China surprised the market with what the commentariat has been quick to term a policy bazooka. But the sum of the stimulus measures so far announced are just 1.5% of GDP, with a further 2.4% of GDP rumoured. This looks more like a pop gun to me, relative to the 13% of GDP stimulus announced in 2008 and 9% of GDP that the Chinese announced in 2015 to 16, when arguably the Chinese economy was structurally in better shape than it is now. Moreover, whilst the PBOC swap facility for domestic financial institutions has engineered a short squeeze in the equity market in time for the 75th birthday celebrations of the Chinese Communist Party, it is unlikely to have sufficient multiplier effects to overcome the structural balance sheet recession and oversupply of overvalued and overleveraged property in China. Now, China now has a geopolitical ambition for its currency, the renminbi, to achieve global reserve status. Now, that seems to be at odds with the obvious reflationary solution for its economy, which is to devalue its currency and to deploy large-scale QE. China also seeks to revive its stock market, but it doesn't want capitalism. So it's continuing a policy of hostility to entrepreneurs, and it fails to provide international capital the ability to be able to carry out adequate due diligence or give confidence on long-term property rights. China, in fact, demonstrates how capital is always and everywhere allocated less efficiently by the state relative to the invisible hand of Adam Smith's market economy, and is now stuck in the same economic malaise which ultimately saw the downfall of the Soviet Union 40 years ago. Now, on the 8th of September, Europe's eminent Greece, former ECB president and Italian technocrat prime minister Mario Draghi, published his report into the European growth sclerosis entitled The Future of European Competitiveness. Now, Draghi's report correctly diagnoses many of the problems in Europe: high energy prices, over-regulation, lack of productivity, and entrepreneurialism. Draghi highlights an existential economic challenge in meeting the existential challenge of climate change. He says, if Europe cannot be more productive, we will be forced to choose. We will not be able to become at once a leader in new technologies, a beacon of climate responsibility, and an independent player on the world stage. We will not be able to finance our social model. We will have to scale back some, if not all, of our ambitions. This is an existential challenge. It seems nowadays that all challenges are existential. Nevertheless, it is beyond Draghi's intellectual hinterland to ask whether the same dogma of the energy transition is in fact the cause, not the solution to economic decline, or understand that governments are even worse than fund managers at picking winners. But just as the Chinese Communist Party is constrained by the dogma of communist political control, Draghi must offer solutions consistent with the religion of climate change alarmism and the increase in the authority of the EU. Hence his risible solution to Europe's economic problems that the EU spend an additional 800 billion euros, or roughly 4.5% of GDP annually, largely on picking winners in green technology. Now, we need to think about the religious aspects of the climate change movement, which act as a mental block for policymakers. According to the great British art historian Kenneth Clark, early converts to Christianity were seduced not by images of the crucifixion, which was an unpromising recruiting sergeant, but by promises of miracle healings and life after death. Nowadays, from an early age, converts to the green energy transition have been promised environmental atonement for mankind and the salvation of the polar bear. But we are not told about the crucifying economic costs of the energy transition. The climate change religion lies about the economic cost of the energy transition, repeating the catechism that expensive renewable energy is cheap and that the costs of intermittency can be easily overcome. We can also see that the European car industry is now in its death throes. It is not currently possible, and may never be, for European car makers to profitably produce a desirable mass market EV. Meanwhile, Chinese OEMs, who claim to have a battery technology edge, but are also backstopped by the Chinese government subsidies, take market share. Without government meddling, EU OEMs would continue to satisfy consumer demands by profitably producing internal combustion engine cars. But the EU operates an increasingly penal tax credit and debit system, meaning that auto manufacturers are coerced into producing fewer internal combustion engine cars. The logical consequence of this is that the EU car industry will, like the UK industry before it, cease to be a mass market industry. This will result in the hollowing out of the European industrial base. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the Israeli-Iran conflict and its likely impact on global energy markets. So on October the 1st, Iran fired 181 ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv, representing a significant escalation in the conflict and highlighting the dangers of the Mullah state in future acquiring a nuclear warhead. Now, we see a further escalation in the conflict, and we see also, from an investment point of view, the likelihood that Iran has its 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day of oil export capability impaired either by sanctions or by military strikes. Now, reading the tea leaves, we think it's unlikely that the US would go along with this without a promise from the Saudis to also increase their production to compensate from the lost Iranian barrels. Indeed, separately, the Saudi has been increasing its desire to recapture market share within the global oil market and is more focused on that for perhaps geopolitical reasons rather than its desired previous target of $100 a barrel for crude oil. Now, in terms of how that affects our investments, clearly we want, therefore, to position in stocks that are going to benefit from increased Saudi production rather than those that are necessarily going to just benefit from a higher oil price, which may not last for that long. So we continue to be confident in our positions in the fund, and those positions are aligned to the views as expressed in this video. Thank you.